The watch landed on the counter between them with a sound like a gunshot in the silence of the dry goods store, and Winifred Fletcher felt the world tilt beneath her feet. It was her father's watch. She knew it before she even touched it, knew it the way a person knows their own heartbeat, by the particular way the silver case caught light, by the hairline scratch along the left edge that had been there since she was 7 years old and had dropped it on the stone floor of their old house in Missouri. The engraving on the back read simply, EF, for every mile. The man who had set it down was a stranger. Tall, lean in the way of a man who had missed too many meals and walked too many miles to soften at the edges. His eyes were the color of deep water in shadow, not quite blue, not quite gray, and they were fixed on her with an expression she could not immediately name. It was not cruelty. It was not indifference. It was something far more dangerous than either of those things. It looked, somehow, like recognition. "My name is Chester Shepard," he said. His voice was low and careful, the voice of a man who had learned to measure his words like ammunition. "Your father was Elias Fletcher." It was not a question. Winifred's hand moved to the watch before her mind caught up to what her body already understood. Her fingers closed around the silver case, and the warmth of the metal, warmed by this stranger's pocket, hit her like a physical blow. "Where did you get this?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her. She had spent most of the last year falling apart in private, and here she was, holding together in front of a man she had never seen before in her life, a man who was watching her with those impossible eyes as though she were something he had been searching for without knowing it. "He asked me to find someone worth giving it to," Chester Shepard said. The words detonated inside her chest like a stick of dynamite with a short fuse. She had to grip the edge of the counter with her free hand to keep from swaying. "He is dead," she said. It was not another question either. She already knew. She had known for 6 months, since the sheriff from Abilene had ridden out to her spread with his hat in his hands and an apology in his eyes. But somehow hearing this stranger speak her father's name in the past tense, somehow holding the watch that her father had never once in her living memory been without, made it new and terrible all over again. "Yes, ma'am," Chester said. "He is." The dry goods store smelled of flour and tobacco, and the particular metallic tang of the Kansas summer heat pressing in through the open door. Outside, the main street of Caldwell was going about its ordinary business, horses plodding, boots raising small clouds of dust from the packed earth, a woman calling to a child across the way. None of it seemed real. None of it seemed to belong to the same world as this moment. Winifred Fletcher had not cried in front of another living soul since the day they buried what little the undertaker had been able to recover of her father. She was not going to cry now. "You had better," she said carefully. "Tell me everything." It had begun, as so many things in the West began, with cattle and with distance. The year was 1878, and Winifred was 26 years old, which in the common estimation of Sumner County, Kansas, made her a woman who had missed her prime window for marriage and had no one to blame for it but her own stubbornness. This estimation she had long since stopped caring about, having found that cattle did not comment on her marital status, and the land did not require her to simper to be managed. Her father, Elias Fletcher, had homesteaded the spread outside Caldwell 10 years earlier when Winifred was 16, pulling them up from a failing farm in Missouri and replanting them in the Kansas grassland with the particular brand of relentless optimism that had characterized everything he ever did. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a laugh that started in his belly and worked its way upward, and he had a habit of trusting strangers that Winifred had always considered either his greatest virtue or his most dangerous flaw, depending on the day. He had trusted Chester Shepard. And that, as Chester explained to her in the dry goods store that afternoon, and then more completely later that evening on the porch of her ranch house, with the vast Kansas sky going through its spectacular, indifferent sunset overhead, was the whole complicated, tragic, inexplicable heart of the story. Chester had drifted into Abilene in the spring of 1877, which was what Chester did, drifting being less a choice than a condition by that point in his life. He was 28 years old and had been moving since he was 19, ever since the farm in Tennessee had gone under and his family had scattered, and he had discovered that he did not know how to stay anywhere without something to stay for. He had been working as a cattle drover, which kept him moving on a regular schedule between Texas and Kansas, and it was on one of those drives that he had met Elias Fletcher, who had come to Abilene to sell a portion of his herd and had ended up, through the particular mathematics of cattle trading and saloon conviviality, spending 3 days in close company with Chester Shepard. "Your father," Chester told Winifred, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees and turning his hat in his hands in a slow, habitual circle, "was the kind of man that made you want to be better than you were, not because he pressured you, just because being around him made the possibility seem real." Winifred looked at him steadily. The evening light was doing something complicated to his face, pulling shadows into the angles of it, and she was trying very hard not to notice that it was a face she wanted to keep looking at, which seemed both inappropriate and irrelevant given the circumstances. "He had that effect," she agreed. "He talked about you," Chester said. "Every day, almost. Told me about how you had kept the ranch running through the drought 2 summers back, how you had renegotiated the supply contract with the trading post yourself when the terms went sideways. He was proud of you in a way that was almost painful to hear because it was so uncomplicated. He just loved you without reservation." She pressed her lips together. The sunset was being entirely too beautiful. She resented it. "He never said any of that to my face," she said. "No," Chester said. "Men of his generation tended not to, but I promise you he meant every word." What happened next in the story, the part that Chester had to pause twice to tell and that Winifred had to sit very still to hear, was this. Elias Fletcher, returning from Abilene with the proceeds of his cattle sale, had been set upon on the Kishom Trail by a pair of men operating at the edge of the law in that lawless corridor. There had been a struggle. Elias had been shot. He had not died immediately, which was perhaps the cruelest part of it, but had lived long enough to be found by Chester, who had been riding south on a return drive and had come across the scene. Chester had done what he could, which was not enough, because sometimes what you can do is not enough, and the West was not a country that rewarded sentiment over mathematics. He had sat with Elias Fletcher for 3 hours in the shade of a scrub oak while the older man's body made its slow, terrible accounting. And in those 3 hours, Elias had talked. He had talked about Winifred. He had talked about the ranch and the well that needed relining, and the southeastern fence line that had been giving trouble since the spring thaw. He had talked about Missouri and the stone floor and the watch, and about his wife who had died when Winifred was 12 and who had given him the watch on the occasion of their 10th wedding anniversary. And at the end, when the talking was getting difficult, he had pressed the watch into Chester's hand and he had said it. "He asked me to find someone worth giving this to." "And you took that seriously," Winifred said. Her voice was barely above a whisper now, and the sunset had the decency to begin fading. "I took it seriously," Chester said. "It has been more than a year. I know. It took you a year to find me." Something shifted in his expression, a small, complicated movement that she could not quite decipher. "It took me a year to decide whether I was worth anything at all," he said. "Finding you was not the difficult part." The silence that followed that confession sat between them like a living thing, warm and uncertain. Winifred Fletcher looked at this man, this stranger who was not entirely a stranger anymore, who had held her father's hand while he died and had carried a watch across the better part of a year because he had made a promise to a dying man on a Kansas trail. She looked at his worn clothes and his careful eyes and his hands that were turning the brim of his hat with the nervous energy of a man who rarely allowed himself to be nervous. She thought about secrets and hidden burdens and the dark past that a man accumulates when he has been moving without stopping for almost a decade. "Where are you staying tonight?" she asked. He looked mildly startled. "I had planned on the boarding house in town." "The boarding house charges $1.25 a night," she said, "which seems excessive for a man who has been doing a good deed for a year without pay. There is a bunkhouse. It is empty because I cannot currently afford to hire hands. You may stay there tonight, and tomorrow you will tell me the rest of it." "The rest of what?" "The rest of whatever you are not saying," she said. "There is always more. My father trusted you with that watch, Mr. Shepard, and I have decided to extend you the same provisional courtesy. But I am not my father. I do not trust without reason." Chester Shepard looked at her for a long moment with those gray-blue eyes that seemed to see further than was comfortable, and then he nodded. "That is fair," he said. She gave him a blanket and showed him the bunkhouse, which smelled of old straw and was sparely furnished but clean, because Winifred Fletcher kept things clean on principle. She went back to the ranch house and sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the watch in her hand and the lamp burning low, and she did not allow herself to cry until she was certain he was asleep. Then she did, briefly and with great efficiency, and then she washed her face and went to bed. The next morning arrived with the breathless clarity that Kansas summer morning specialized in, all bright light and enormous sky, and the particular smell of warm grass that meant the day would be hot before long. Winifred was up at 5, as she always was, and was halfway through feeding the horses when she noticed that Chester Shepard was already awake. He was at the well, drawing water, moving with the economical competence of someone who had spent a lifetime doing physical work without thinking about it. He had seen her and given a brief, respectful nod, and then gone back to what he was doing. She watched him for a moment with a critical eye. He worked well. There was a rhythm to it that spoke of genuine habit rather than the performance of industry. She had hosted enough drifters passing through, asking for a meal or a night's lodging in exchange for an hour's work, to know the difference between a man who worked and a man who was willing to be seen appearing to work. "You can put the water in the trough," she called. "The bay is already thirsty and we are going to be short by mid-morning." "Yes, ma'am," he called back and did it. Over breakfast, which she cooked because she had made more cornbread than she needed and the eggs needed using, she asked him the direct question. "Where do you go from here?" He looked up from his plate. "I had not decided." "Had not or will not?" A pause. "Both, possibly." "You said last night that it took you a year to decide you were worth something," she said. "What made you doubt it?" She was direct. She had always been direct, which was a trait her father had admired and which had contributed to most of Caldwell's married women finding her mildly exhausting to socialize with. Chester, however, did not look exhausted by the question. He looked, if anything, relieved. "I was involved," he said slowly, "in something I should not have been about 2 years ago. Not the Abilene violence, something before. In Texas. I was young and I was broke and someone offered me work and I did not ask enough questions about the nature of the work." "What kind of work?" He set down his fork. "I was a lookout," he said, "for men who were moving cattle they did not own. I did not know that at first. When I figured it out, I left. But I had already been part of it for 3 weeks and I had taken the money and I had to live with that." "Did you report it?" "No, I was afraid." He said it simply, without self-pity or excuse, which she found oddly more credible than a more complicated answer would have been. "I was 19 and I was afraid and I told myself it was not my problem." By the time I had enough distance to feel ashamed, the men were long gone and there was nothing to report to anyway. Winifred considered this. She turned her coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. "You were 19, she said, "and you have been punishing yourself for it ever since." "Something like that." "My father knew about this. I told him, those 3 days in Abilene. He had a way of drawing things out of you." Chester's voice went quiet at the end of the sentence. "He said that a man who carries guilt is a man who still has a conscience. He said I needed to stop using the past as an excuse to avoid the present." Winifred was quiet for a moment. Outside, the bay horse made a sound of great contentment at the water trough. The wind moved through the grass with a sound like something breathing. "He was right," she said finally. "He usually was. It was infuriating." Chester looked at her, and for the first time the corners of his mouth moved toward something that was not quite a smile but was the possibility of one. "He said that too," Chester said. "Almost those exact words." Something loosened in the room between them. Not entirely, not the way things loosen when a knot simply falls free, but the way they loosen when you find the right place to pull and the tension begins incrementally to ease. "I need help," Winifred said abruptly. "The ranch is in poor shape. Not because I cannot manage it, but because there is only one of me and there are 200 acres and a fence line that is actively trying to escape into the next county. I cannot pay wages, not real wages, not until after the fall sale." Chester looked at her carefully. "Are you offering me work?" "I am offering you a place to be," she said, "in exchange for labor. The bunkhouse is yours. The meals are mine. If the fall sale goes well, there will be wages. If it does not go well, at least you will have spent the summer somewhere with four walls and food, which I understand is not always a certainty in your current line of life." He was quiet for a long time, looking at his coffee cup. She waited because she had learned that patience was a more effective tool than pressure, in ranching and in most other things. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why what?" "Why trust me? You said last night that you do not trust without reason." "I said I extend provisional courtesy," she corrected. "And the reason is that my father trusted you, and my father was an excellent judge of character who was almost never wrong about people. He gave you that watch on purpose, Mr. Shepard, not because you were convenient, but because he believed you were worth the gesture. I have learned to trust his judgment even when I did not always follow it while he was alive." Chester Shepard looked at her across the table in the bright morning of the Kansas summer, and she could see something working behind his eyes, some long-held, stubborn resistance beginning to lose the argument against itself. "All right," he said. "I will stay." He stayed. In the beginning it was purely practical, which was the only way Winifred would have allowed it to be. Chester was competent and hardworking and did not require management, which she appreciated in the way she appreciated a well-trained horse, with admiration and a degree of relief. He assessed the fence situation on his first full day and drew up a repair plan in order of priority that was so sensible she would have been annoyed if it had not been so immediately useful. They worked alongside each other through the long July heat, and they fell into a rhythm that was comfortable in the way that serious work beside a capable partner always is, built on efficiency rather than comfort, on usefulness rather than sentiment. He did not treat her as though she needed protecting from the work, which put him ahead of every other hired hand she had ever managed. In the evenings they sat on the porch because the ranch house held the heat badly, and the porch caught whatever breeze the prairie offered. Sometimes they talked, and sometimes they did not, and both of the options felt equally natural, which Winifred found disconcerting in the way that comfortable things are disconcerting when you are not accustomed to them. She learned things about him in the slow accumulation of evenings. He had grown up in eastern Tennessee, the second of 4 children, on a tobacco farm that had gone under when a combination of poor soil management and a disease that moved through the leaves like fire had destroyed 2 consecutive crops. His father was not a bad man but was a defeated one, and defeat in men of that generation tended to express itself in silence, which was a sound Chester had been unable to bear. He had left at 19 with a horse and $30 and the guilty secret he had told her about, and had been moving ever since. He read, which surprised her. He had a copy of David Copperfield in his saddlebag, much worn, that he had apparently carried for 3 years. He read it in the evenings when the light lasted and he was not, she occasionally caught herself noticing, an unattractive sight reading, which was an irrelevant observation that she made with some frequency regardless. She told him things in return, because equity demanded it, and because he listened in the particular attentive way of someone who was genuinely interested rather than merely polite. She told him about her mother, Eleanor, who had died of a fever when Winifred was 12, and who had been the kind of woman that rooms rearranged themselves around, luminous and certain, and completely herself. She told him about the drought and the fear, and the 2 years of counting every cent and mending things that should have been replaced, and how she had learned, in that period, that she was more capable of endurance than she had previously understood. She told him about the men who had come courting over the years, sent by their mothers or their own ambition, who had looked at the Fletcher spread and seen either an asset to be acquired or a problem to be solved, and how she had sent all of them away without regret. "None of them ever asked what I wanted," she said one evening. "The stars were astonishing, the way they always were out here, away from the lamp glow of town. They had already decided what I needed, which they assumed coincided with what was convenient for them." Chester was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" he asked. She looked at him, and the straightforwardness of the question, offered without agenda or subtext, caught her unprepared. "I want the ranch to be solvent," she said, which was the honest and practical answer. "I want the well relined before fall. I want to feel one morning like I have enough hands and enough money and enough time to actually breathe without it costing something. And personally," he said. She looked at the stars for a moment. "I want someone who asks me questions," she said, "and then listens to the answers." He did not say anything to that, which was, she thought later, the most reassuring possible response. August came in brutal and dry, the kind of Kansas August that made the land look like it was being tested by something that did not have patience for failure. The grass went the color of old hay, and the creek dropped to a thread, and the heat was a physical presence that leaned on you from mid-morning until after dark. They worked through it because there was nothing else to do. Chester proved invaluable at the kind of problem-solving that drover work had given him, the improvised, practical intelligence of a man who had spent years managing complicated logistics with whatever was at hand. The fence line came under control. The well was relined with the help of Chester's own labor and the cooperation of Jim Aldridge, the neighboring rancher to the east, who owed Winifred a favor from the previous spring, and paid it in 2 days of work and the use of his block and tackle. It was during the well relining that Jim Aldridge made an observation that Winifred heard from the other side of the ranch house wall while she was bringing water. "Your man seems to know what he is doing," Jim said. "He is not my man," Winifred said, coming around the corner with the water bucket. Jim, who was 60 years old and had the diplomatic sensitivity of a fence post, shrugged. "If you say so," he said, in the tone of a man who clearly did not say so. That evening, setting the table for supper, Winifred caught herself noticing that she had set 2 places without thinking about it, that the second place was Chester's place now, in some habitual understanding that her hands had arrived at independently of any decision she remembered making. She stood with the second fork in her hand for a moment, looking at it. Then she put it down and went to call him in for supper. It was 2 weeks into August when the trouble arrived, and trouble in the West had a way of arriving the way weather did, visible on the horizon long before it reached you, but no less destructive for the warning. The 2 men who rode onto the Fletcher ranch on a Wednesday afternoon were named Burl Casson and Ed Harrow, and they were the same men who had stopped Elias Fletcher on the Kishom Trail 14 months earlier. Winifred did not know this yet. Chester, who had come in from the far pasture and had reached the yard just as the 2 men were dismounting, knew it immediately. He had seen them from a distance that day on the trail, not close enough to intervene, close enough to remember their faces in the particular way that helpless witnesses remember details. He said nothing immediately. He stood at the edge of the yard with a hammer still in his hand from the fence work, and he looked at them, and he calculated. Burl Casson was the sort of man who wore his violence comfortably, the way other men wore their hats, as a natural part of the outfit. He was large and ruddy with small eyes that moved constantly, assessing. Ed Harrow was quieter and therefore, in Chester's estimation, more dangerous. They introduced themselves as cattle buyers passing through, which was a story with the texture of something assembled quickly from available parts. "We heard Fletcher's spread had stock to sell," Burl said. addressing Winifred with the particular brand of expansive friendliness that men employ when they are concealing something. Came to discuss terms. Winifred's eyes went at Chester for a fraction of a second, the reflexive check of someone who had grown accustomed to having a second opinion available. Chester gave her nothing with his expression, which was the most communicative thing he could have done. She was a perceptive woman. "The fall sale is not until October," she said. "Not taking early offers." "Well now," Burl said, "we are prepared to make it worth your while to reconsider." "I have no doubt," Winifred said. "Nevertheless." There was a moment in which Burl's pleasant expression strained at the edges, and Chester shifted his weight very slightly, and Ed Harrow's eyes did a quiet tour of the yard and the ranch house and the bunkhouse and the open space between them. "All right," Burl said. The pleasantness reassembled itself. "We will be in Caldwell for a few days. You change your mind, you know where to find us." They rode out, and the yard felt different after they left, as though the air had an opinion about them. "Tell me," Winifred said the moment they were gone. Chester set down the hammer. His voice was very level. "I need you to go inside and stay inside until I come back." "That is not what I said. I said tell me." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she was beginning to understand meant he was deciding how much to protect her from and how much to respect her right to know. He seemed to decide in favor of respect. "Those men," he said quietly, "were on the trail when your father was shot." The stillness that went through her was the kind that happens before lightning, when everything is briefly and absolutely motionless. "You are certain," she said. "Yes. What do we do?" "I am going to ride to Caldwell and speak to Sheriff Calloway," he said. "I need you to stay here with the rifle loaded and not open the door to those men if they come back." Chester. It was the first time she had used his given name, and it came out differently than she expected, with a weight she had not intended but did not take back. "You were there. You are a witness. If you go to the sheriff, you are putting yourself in the path of whatever comes after." He picked up his hat from where he had left it on the fence post. "Yes," he said, "I know. They will not simply accept being brought before the law. Men like that do not. No, they probably will not." "Then why?" "Because your father is owed it," he said, simply and without flourish. And she had nothing to say to that, because it was so completely, straightforwardly true. She watched him saddle up with her arms crossed and her jaw tight, and when he rode out she stood in the yard for a long moment before she went inside and loaded the rifle and sat down at the kitchen table to wait, which was the hardest thing she had done in recent memory, and recent memory included a lot of genuinely hard things. Sheriff Calloway was a measured man in his mid-50s who had survived the various incarnations of Caldwell's lawlessness by being consistently harder to manage than the people who tried to manage him. He listened to Chester's account without interruption, asked 3 precise questions, and sent a deputy to quietly verify that Casson and Harrow were indeed at the boarding house before doing anything that might send them running. They were. What followed over the next day and a half was the careful machinery of frontier law, which moved slowly but, when it was working correctly, moved with a grinding inevitability. The territorial marshal was telegraphed. 2 witnesses from Abilene who had known Elias Fletcher were contacted. Casson and Harrow were brought in for questioning before they understood what the questioning was about, and by the time they understood, it was too late for the conversation to go anywhere useful for them. There were darker aspects to it that Winifred only heard about secondhand, and that Chester told her with the careful economy of a man editing for her sake. And she allowed this, which surprised her, because she did not usually allow people to edit for her sake. But the essential result was this. Burl Casson and Ed Harrow were charged with the murder of Elias Fletcher, confirmed by the territorial marshal's office on the basis of Chester's testimony, and 3 additional pieces of corroborating evidence that Sheriff Calloway had quietly assembled. They would face trial in Wichita in the fall. Chester came home, which was the word Winifred's brain applied to his return to the ranch without consulting her, and she met him in the yard and he told her all of it. And she stood in the late afternoon light holding herself very carefully together, and then she said, "Thank you," He nodded once. "Are you in danger?" she asked. "As a witness?" "I do not believe so. The marshal's office has the case well in hand. My testimony was recorded formally. Calloway seems to understand what he is doing. Will you need to go to Wichita for the trial?" "Likely, yes, in October." October, 2 months away. She did not examine why the timeline mattered to her in the particular way it did. "Then you will stay until October," she said, "and we will deal with October in October." He agreed. What changed between them in the weeks after that was subtle and not subtle at all, depending on the angle from which you observed it. It was not sudden. It was the kind of thing that happens when two people have been in each other's proximity through enough difficulty and enough ordinary life that the boundary between stranger and known person becomes unclear, and then clearer again, but different, the boundary redrawn somewhere new. She started telling him things that she had not told anyone in years, not because she decided to, but because he asked questions and listened to the answers with such genuine attention that it seemed natural to answer completely. She told him about the fear that she covered with practicality, the constant low-level terror of losing the ranch that she had managed alone for 2 years. She told him about the loneliness that she covered with self-sufficiency, which was the more personal and more vulnerable admission of the two. He told her things too. He told her about the years of movement, the droves and the trail camps and the brief, unsuccessful attempts at settling that had always eventually come undone. He told her about the particular quality of loneliness that comes from choosing movement as a defense against loss, and how it does not actually protect you from loss, it just changes the shape of it. "You have been running," she said one evening. "The porch, the stars, the warm dark of a Kansas September night." "Yes," he said, "I am aware of that." "What were you running from?" He was quiet for a moment. "The possibility of staying somewhere and having it go wrong," he said. "If you never stop moving, you never have to watch something you built fall apart." She considered this. "That is cowardly," she said, but gently. "Yes," he said, "it is. But you stayed here." "Yes. Why?" He turned to look at her, and the stars were doing their impractical, irrelevant, beautiful thing overhead, and he said, "Because from the first day I rode onto this place, I have not been able to think of a good reason to leave, and I have tried." Winifred Fletcher, who had built a life out of pragmatism and endurance and the careful management of her own heart, felt something in the center of her chest make a sound like a door opening. She did not say anything. She looked at him, in the dark, with the enormous Kansas sky above them, and she thought about betrayal and secrets and dark pasts, and all the sensible reasons not to trust a drifter with a complicated history, and she thought about her father pressing a watch into a stranger's hand and saying, "Find someone worth giving this to." And she thought about the look on Chester Shepard's face when she had first told him he could stay. "I am not an easy person to be around," she said. "No," he agreed, "you are not. I am opinionated and direct, and I do not defer well to other people's judgment. I have noticed, and I will not change any of that. I would not ask you to." "Then what are you asking?" He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful and genuine, and careful and genuine were not words that were often combined to such honest effect. "I am not asking anything yet," he said. "I am just telling you that I do not want to leave. What you do with that is entirely your decision." She looked at the stars for a moment more. Then she said, in the quiet, matter-of-fact tone she used for practical decisions, "All right. That is good information to have." And then she went inside because she needed to think about it without him watching her think about it, and he stayed on the porch, and she suspected he stayed there for quite a long time. September moved through them the way the season did, gradually and then all at once, the heat releasing in increments, the grass coming back from its burnt-out summer color, the light shifting its angle. The ranch improved. Not spectacularly, not in the way that would have required resources she did not have, but solidly and practically, in the way of things that are being properly maintained for the first time in too long. The fence held. The cattle were healthy. The hay was cut and stacked in adequate quantity for the winter feeding, which Chester and Winifred accomplished together in a long, brutal week that left them both sunburned and exhausted, and, by the end of it, laughing about things that were not technically funny but became funny through sheer accumulated tiredness. It was at the end of that week, on a Friday evening, standing at the well washing the hay dust off her hands and arms and face, that Winifred understood she was in love with Chester Shepard. She did not make a production of the understanding. It arrived with the quiet certainty of something that has been true for a while and is only now being officially acknowledged. She straightened up from the well, water running off her chin, and she looked at Chester, who was doing the same thing 20 feet away, and she thought, "Yes, all right, this is what this is." Then she finished washing up and went to start supper, because the recognition of a feeling did not by itself change any of the practical realities of the evening. She thought about it for 3 more days before she did anything about it, and what she eventually did was characteristically undramatic. She waited until they were in the middle of an argument about the most efficient way to rotate the cattle through the south pasture, which was the kind of argument they had regularly, and which she generally enjoyed more than was strictly necessary, and she said, in the middle of it, "Chester, I need to tell you something." He stopped mid-sentence. Something in her tone apparently signaled a change in subject. "I have been thinking," she said carefully, looking at him rather than away from him, because looking away would have felt like a retreat she was not willing to make. "About what you said on the porch 3 weeks ago, about not wanting to leave." He was very still. "I think," she said, "that I do not want you to leave either, and not only because you are useful though you are, which I want to acknowledge in the interest of full honesty." She paused. "I think I would like to try." She paused again, searching for words that were accurate and not more frightening than necessary. "I would like to find out whether the feeling I have about you amounts to something real, or whether it is simply the result of gratitude and proximity. How would you propose to find that out?" He asked, and his voice was very quiet. "I thought perhaps we might spend time together in a way that is less exclusively practical," she said, deliberately, to see. The corner of his mouth moved in the way it had been doing more frequently lately, the movement toward the smile she had been watching develop for 2 months. "You are asking me to court you," he said. "I am suggesting we court each other," she said, "with mutual volition and no predetermined conclusions." "Winifred," he said, and the way he said her name was a small, distinct thing, careful and warm. "That is the most practical invitation to romance I have ever received. Is that a yes?" "Yes," he said. "That is most definitely a yes." What followed was, Winifred supposed, what passed for courtship in the particular conditions of their life, which meant that the practicalities did not stop, because the ranch did not stop, but alongside and around the practicalities, something else was permitted to exist. He brought her wildflowers from the creek bank one morning, not as a grand gesture but as a quiet one, simply setting them on the kitchen table without comment. She found a copy of Middlemarch at the Mercantile in Caldwell and bought it because she wanted to read it, and also, she admitted to herself, because he had mentioned once that he had never read it. They rode together in the evenings when the work allowed it, out across the open grass in the long summer light, and they talked the way people talk when they are gradually removing the remaining distance between themselves, carefully and with intermittent courage. He kissed her, eventually, one evening in early October, standing on the porch in the last of the autumn light. It was not a sudden thing. It was the conclusion of a sentence that had been building for several months, and it lasted long enough to be entirely clear about its meaning. When it ended, she looked at him with the same level directness she looked at everything. "That was," she said, "considerably better than I had been permitting myself to expect." He laughed, and it was the most unfettered sound she had heard him make, unguarded and genuine, and she thought, "I want to hear that sound for the rest of my life," and that thought no longer frightened her the way it once might have. October brought the cattle sale and it brought the trial in Wichita, and both of them were complicated in different ways. Chester rode to Wichita at the beginning of October with Sheriff Cowboy, who was transporting 2 additional witnesses. The trial of Burl Casson and Ed Harrow took 4 days. Chester testified on the second day, giving a clear and unsparing account of what he had found on the Kishom Trail, what Elias Fletcher had said in those 3 hours, and the identities of the men he had seen near the scene. The verdict came back on the 4th day. Both men were found guilty of murder. They were sentenced to hang. Chester came back to the Fletcher ranch on a Thursday afternoon, and Winifred was in the yard when he rode in, and she watched him dismount and stand for a moment with one hand on his horse's neck as though steadying himself. She walked over to him. "It is done," he said. "Yes," she said. She put her hand over his on the horse's neck. He turned his palm up and closed his fingers around hers, and they stood like that for a moment in the autumn yard with the cottonwoods showing their yellow and the sky its deep October blue. "Your father is answered for," he said. "Yes." She squeezed his hand. "Because of you. Because of what he asked of me," Chester said. "I just tried to be worth it." She looked at him. This man who had carried a watch across a year and a guilty conscience across a decade, and had arrived in her dry goods store on a June afternoon and changed everything. She thought about all of it, the watch and the promise and the work and the evenings on the porch and the wildflowers on the table and the kiss in the fading October light. "Chester," she said. "Yes. I am in love with you," she said. "I thought you should know that clearly rather than implied." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the most undefended she had ever seen him. All the careful management of his feelings simply dissolved, and what was underneath was something so straightforward and bright that it was almost painful to look at. "Winifred," he said, "I have been in love with you since the 3rd week of July when you told Jim Aldridge without hesitation that the southeast pasture was not included in the fence easement. And you did it with such complete calm authority that I realized I had never in my life met anyone quite like you." "The 3rd week of July," she said. "That is very specific." "I have been noting the date carefully," he said, "in case it ever became relevant." She laughed, and he pulled her closer by their joined hands, and she did not resist, because she was done resisting things that she had already decided she wanted. The cattle sale went well enough. Not spectacularly, not in the way that resolves all problems at once, but solidly. The numbers were better than the previous year, because the herd was healthier than the previous year, which was directly attributable to the summer's better management. Winifred paid Chester the wages she had promised, which he accepted after a brief argument that she won by the simple expedient of being correct about the terms of their original agreement. "That was the deal," she said flatly. "You are not permitted to renegotiate after the fact." "I am not trying to renegotiate, I am trying to decline. Those are the same thing in this context. Take the money, Chester." He took the money, but he spent most of it on supplies for the ranch, which she chose to view as an expression of commitment rather than another attempt to refuse payment, because the alternative interpretation was too infuriating. November arrived, and the question of what came next became more pressing without either of them making it explicitly pressing. Winifred was aware, with the practical awareness that was her primary mode of operation, that Chester's situation at the ranch was undefined in ways that would eventually require definition. He was not a hired hand in any meaningful sense anymore, or not primarily that. He was not a guest, had not been for months. He was something for which the available social categories of 1878 Sumner County, Kansas were not quite adequate. She thought about it carefully, and then, because she had always found the direct approach most efficient, she thought about it at him instead of about it alone. They were sitting at the kitchen table one November evening with the lamp burning and the wind making its considerable commentary on the state of the windows, and she had been reading and he had been doing the same, and she put her book down and looked at him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He looked up. "The spring calving schedule. The numbers suggest we should plan for Chester." "Yes." "Not practically." "What are you thinking about?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the direct, clear attention he gave to things that mattered. "Whether you would be willing to marry me," he said. "I have been trying to determine the correct way to ask." She looked at him steadily. Her heart was doing something with no practical justification at all. "There is no incorrect way to ask," she said. "The asking is the thing." "Then I am asking," he said. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice quiet and certain. "I know my history is complicated, and my past is not without its dark corners, and I have spent most of my adult life proving that I am not particularly good at staying in one place. But I am good at it here. I am good at it with you, and I believe if you will give me the chance, I could spend a very long time being good at it." Winifred Fletcher looked at the man across the table, the man who had brought back her father's watch and her father's last act of faith and had, in the process, become indispensable to her in ways she had not anticipated and did not regret. She thought about all the sensible reasons to be cautious and all the honest reasons not to be. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you." His breath went out of him in a long, quiet release, as though he had been holding it for longer than one conversation. "Thank you," he said, which was not the typical response to a marriage acceptance, but was, she thought, entirely characteristic of him. "Do not thank me," she said. "I expect you to earn it." "Every day," he said with great seriousness. "Good," she said, and picked up her book again because they were who they were, and the lamp was burning, and there was still an hour before bed. They were married in Caldwell in late November, in the small white church on the main street that had been built 2 years earlier, and still smelled more of new wood than of any particular sanctity. The minister was a thin, energetic man named Reverend Paulson, who seemed genuinely pleased by the occasion, and conducted the service with an efficiency that Winifred appreciated. The witnesses were Sheriff Calloway, who came out of a sense of responsibility toward the proceedings, and Clara Aldridge, Jim's wife, who had decided in September that she liked Chester Shepard and had been advocating for this outcome with more enthusiasm than Winifred had technically requested. Clara cried. Jim did not, but it was a near thing. Calloway looked dignified. The ceremony itself was brief and meaningful in equal measure, and when Chester took her hands in his and said the words, he said them in the same voice he used for things that mattered completely, low and careful and absolutely certain, and she said hers the same way because she was. Afterward they rode back to the ranch together in the cold November air, side by side on horseback, and the land was bare and beautiful in the way that the prairie is in late autumn, stripped down to its essential shape, and the sky was enormous and clear. "Well," Chester said. "Well," Winifred agreed. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand briefly, just for a moment, and then they rode on home together. The winter was long in the way that Kansas winters are long, which means comprehensively, with a sincerity that cannot be argued with. They were largely confined to the ranch, which under other circumstances and with other company would have been an ordeal, and which turned out, in fact, to be something close to its opposite. Winifred discovered that the domestic version of Chester Shepard was not significantly different from the working version, which was a relief. He remained straightforward and honest and useful, and he had an unexpected gift for making things comfortable in small ways. He fixed the kitchen window's draft with an ingenuity that she would not have thought of. He figured out that the stove drew better if the east damper was adjusted by a specific amount, which made a considerable difference to the warmth of the whole first floor. He read to her in the evenings, and she to him, taking turns, and they had excellent arguments about the books and about other things, and the arguments were some of her favorite times, which told her something about herself that she filed away with interest. She learned the shape of him as a husband, which was, she thought, the most interesting discovery she had made in recent years, and she had made several significant discoveries. She learned that he slept with fierce concentration, as though he took rest seriously and was applying himself to it. She learned that he woke easily and without complaint, which was fortunate given the demands of ranch life. She learned that he carried his feelings quietly and ran deep, and that the way to know what he was feeling was to ask, because he would always tell you honestly if asked, but would not necessarily volunteer it unprompted. She started asking more, and he started offering more, and they adjusted to each other with the natural intelligence of two people who were both genuinely trying. In February, she told him that she was going to have a child. She told him at breakfast, matter-of-factly, because she was who she was. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression that went through several things in rapid succession: surprise, wonder, something that was recognizably fear about responsibility, and then something else entirely, warm and deep and quiet like water finding its level. "Are you well?" he asked first, which was, she thought, exactly the right first question. "Perfectly well," she said. "It is early yet, but yes." He reached across the table and took her hand, and he held it for a long moment without speaking, and she let him, because some things did not require words, and he knew that about her now, the way she knew the corresponding things about him. "A child," he said finally, quietly, as though trying the weight of it. "A child," she confirmed. "Arriving in late summer, if my calculations are correct." He looked at her with those gray-blue eyes that she had known now in all their gradations, in weariness and humor and desire and grief, and the particular brightness that meant he was completely present to something beautiful. "I am going to do this well," he said. It was not a boast. It was a commitment made to himself as much as to her, the kind of thing a man says when he is doing the work of overwriting an old story about himself. "I know," she said. "So am I." Spring came slowly and then all at once, as it always did, and the ranch woke up with it. There was new work with the spring, and Chester did it with the extra layer of investment that everything seemed to have taken on since February. He was building things, literally and otherwise. He started repairs on the barn that had been needed for 2 years, and that expanded, as repairs tend to do, into improvements that were genuinely significant. Winifred managed the spring calving with her usual efficient calm, modified somewhat by the physical realities of pregnancy, which she found annoying, and managed by refusing to be managed by them to any greater degree than was physically necessary. They wrote to Chester's sister in Tennessee, the only one of his family he was still in contact with. Her name was Ruth, and she wrote back with a letter that made Chester quiet in the good way for most of an evening. She was coming west, she wrote, with her husband and their 2 children to try the territory. There was no room for them in Tennessee anymore, not economically, and the West was calling the way the West called. "She can stay with us," Winifred said before Chester had finished reading the letter aloud. He looked up. "She is your family," Winifred said. "There is room, the ranch will benefit from the help, and your niece and nephew will benefit from growing up with space to run." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am practical," she said. "Those are sometimes the same thing." Ruth and Henry and the 2 children arrived in June, dusty and astonished and grateful, and Ruth Shepard, now Ruth Whitmore, looked at her brother's ranch and her brother's wife with the assessing eye of a woman who knew what mattered, and she said to Winifred within 10 minutes of meeting her, "You are exactly what I hoped for him." "That is an excellent thing to lead with," Winifred said. "I believe in efficiency," Ruth said. "So do I," Winifred said. "I think we will get along." They did, with great enthusiasm. The summer was full in every sense, fuller than any season Winifred could remember. The ranch had enough people in it to make it feel like the thing it was meant to be. Henry Whitmore was a carpenter by trade and quietly invaluable. Ruth had a gift for organization and took over the management of the food stores with an authority that freed Winifred for other things. The 2 Whitmore children, Thomas, who was 8, and Ada, who was 6, ran through the ranch with the abandonment of children who have been given space to be children, and Chester watched them with an expression that Winifred recognized as hopeful in the most tender and specific way. The baby was born on a Saturday in late August. in the room that they had prepared for the purpose, with Clara Aldridge serving as the most capable midwife in the county and Ruth as her capable assistant, and Chester in the main room doing what men did in these situations, which was to be in an agony of helpless concern. The baby was a boy. Chester was allowed in when it was done, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at Winifred in the bed with the wrapped bundle in her arms, and his face did the multiple rapid things it did when he felt deeply. And then he came to sit beside her, and she put the baby in his arms with the careful transfer of something irreplaceable. Chester held his son and looked at him with the concentrated attention of someone encountering something entirely new and entirely significant, and Winifred watched him do it, and thought that this was the kind of moment that justified the whole complicated, unexpected, occasionally terrifying journey of the last year and more. "What shall we call him?" Chester asked. They had talked about names, as people do, but had not decided. Winifred had been thinking about it since she felt the first kicks in the spring. "Elias," she said, "after my father." Chester looked at her. His eyes were doing the thing again, that particular brightness. "Elias Chester Shepard," he said. "Yes," she said. "I think that covers it." The baby, Elias Chester Shepard, apparently agreed with his own name, or at least did not protest it, which in a newborn was the best you could ask for. By the time Elias was 3 months old, the ranch had settled into a new configuration that was both more complicated and more functional than anything Winifred had managed alone. The Whitmore family had set up in the expanded bunkhouse, which Henry had partitioned and improved into genuinely livable quarters. The two spreads were informally cooperating in ways that benefited both. The cattle numbers were up, the fence line was sound, the well was reliable, and the hay stores going into the winter were the best in recent memory. Winifred sat on the porch one October evening, Elias asleep against her shoulder in the particular boneless completeness of infant sleep, and she watched Chester come across the yard from the barn, unhurried, with the easy movement of a man who belongs entirely to the place he is in. He came up to the porch and leaned against the post, looking at the sunset, which was doing its extravagant best. "Good day," she said. "Very good," he said. "The south pasture is looking strong. If we can hold the grass through November, we will not need to start the winter feeding until December at the earliest. I was thinking," she said, "about building a second room onto the north side of the house in the spring." He turned to look at her. "Were you? Elias is going to need his own space eventually, and possibly sooner than eventually, depending on circumstances." He looked at her with the specific attention that meant he was listening beyond the literal content of what she was saying. "Are you suggesting what I think you are suggesting?" "I am suggesting that we plan for the future with the optimism appropriate to our actual situation," she said. "Which is, I think, more stable and good than either of us honestly expected." "Than I expected," he said, with the honesty that was one of his most consistent qualities. "Than I expected too," she admitted. "I had become accustomed to managing alone. I was not expecting to find that managing together was better." He sat beside her on the porch bench, close enough that their shoulders touched, and Elias made a small sound of sleep between them. "Winifred," Chester said, "I need you to know something." "All right. When your father handed me that watch," he said slowly, "I was in the worst stretch of my life, not because of anything external. I had food and work and no one chasing me. But I was hollow in a way I could not fix by moving, and I had been trying for 9 years. And he saw it, the way he seemed to see things, and he put that watch in my hand and he said what he said, and I thought he paused. I thought he was asking something impossible, because the kind of woman worth giving something like that to was the kind of woman I had no right to expect to find." Winifred looked at him. The sunset was orange and gold and entirely too beautiful for a practical person to take seriously, and she took it seriously. "He knew what he was doing," she said. "I know that now," Chester said. "I understood it the afternoon you told me to stop using my past as an excuse to avoid the present. That was when I understood that he had sent me exactly where I needed to go." She looked at the watch, which she wore now on a chain around her neck, the way you wear something that belongs to both memory and present, that connects what was to what is. She had thought in the beginning that the watch was about her father, which it was. But it was also, she had come to understand, about the particular act of faith involved in giving a broken man a purpose and trusting him to grow into it. Elias Fletcher, who had trusted strangers and been right about it more often than not, had trusted one last stranger with one last act of faith, and the stranger had carried it faithfully, and the daughter had honored it by opening her door, and the stranger had, in time, stopped being a stranger at all. He was a good man, Chester said. He was, Winifred said, and he had excellent judgment. Chester looked at her with the expression she loved most, the one that was simply and uncomplicated happiness in the specific present moment, rare in a man who had spent so long avoiding present moments. "Do you know," she said, "I am actually glad you came into that dry goods store." "Only actually glad. Do not push it," she said, but she was already smiling. He laughed, and it was the sound she had decided she wanted to hear for the rest of her life, and she was hearing it. The winter that year was less severe than the previous one, which the old-timers took as a sign of something or other. The ranch was warm. The lamp burned in the evenings, and the books were read, and the arguments were had, and Elias grew the way babies grow, with startling speed and an increasingly complicated personality. He had Winifred's directness and Chester's quiet attention, which was a combination that suggested he would be an interesting person to know. Ruth Whitmore said this at Christmas dinner with great conviction, and Winifred agreed, and Chester looked at his son with the uncomplicated love that had nowhere to hide. Ruth and Henry stayed through the winter and then stayed through the spring, and the informal cooperation between the two households gradually formalized into something that the county would eventually recognize as a family partnership in ranching, which was unusual for the time but not unheard of, and which proved, over the following years, to be both sound and sustaining. Chester built the north room in the spring as promised, and it became necessary by early summer, when Winifred told him, again at breakfast, again matter-of-factly, that they would need it by November. This time he did not put down his coffee cup. He looked at her over it with the brightness in his eyes, and then he set it down deliberately, and he came around the table, and he kissed her with the kind of warmth that 10 months of marriage had not reduced by a single degree. "2 children," he said against her hair. "2 children," she confirmed. "At minimum." He pulled back to look at her. "At minimum. I believe in planning optimistically," she said. "You know this about me." He laughed again, and the sound went through the warm kitchen and out the repaired window into the spring morning of the Kansas prairie. The second child was a girl, born in October of 1880, whom they named Eleanor, for Winifred's mother. She was loud about her opinions from the first hour, which Chester took as a promising sign, and Winifred took as a personal compliment. Elias, 14 months old, regarded his new sister with the serious, scientific attention of someone assessing a new variable in a known system, and then apparently decided she was acceptable. The ranch through the early 1880s was a living, working, growing thing in ways that Winifred had imagined in her most determined and in her most frightened moments, but had never quite believed possible. The cattle numbers grew to the point where they needed a second drover in addition to Chester's own work. Henry Whitmore's carpentry expanded into a small but steady business serving the growing community around Caldwell. Thomas Whitmore, at 12, was already a capable hand with horses. Ada, at 10, had decided she wanted to be a school teacher and was making this ambition known to everyone within conversational range. Winifred ran the ranch's business with the thorough efficiency that had always been her gift, and she ran it better now because she had a partner worth running it with. Chester had become, over the years, someone who was not simply good at staying but who seemed to have resolved, at some fundamental level, the thing that had kept him moving. He had stopped looking, Winifred noticed, as though the ground might shift under him. He had stopped carrying himself with the careful readiness of someone prepared to leave. He was rooted, and the rooting had taken, the way a tree takes in good soil after a difficult season, setting down something deep enough to hold. She told him this one evening in the summer of 1881 when Elias was nearly 3 and Alina was 11 months and the prairie evening was its spectacular, impossible self. "You look like you belong here," she said. He looked at her. "I do belong here. You did not when you arrived. You looked like someone who was not sure whether to trust the ground." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "I was not sure of anything. And now?" He looked at the land, at the ranch house and the rebuilt barn and the lights in the Whitmore bunkhouse and the enormous, indifferent, magnificent sky over all of it. Then he looked at her. "Now," he said, "I am sure of everything that matters." She put her hand in his, and they sat in the evening, and the stars came out one by one over the Kansas prairie. It was in 1882, 4 years after Chester Shepard had walked into the dry goods store in Caldwell with a silver watch in his pocket, that Winifred decided to do the thing she had been thinking about since the first winter. She went to Caldwell, without Chester, on a Wednesday morning. She went to the jeweler who operated out of the back of the hardware store and who did fine work if you gave him enough time. She brought the watch. She did not give it to him to alter. She gave it to him to compliment. She had him make a chain, a proper one strong enough to last, and she had him engrave the back of a small silver fob that she chose to match the watch's style. The engraving took 2 weeks and the result was exactly what she had specified. On the fob it read, "C.S. He was worth it." She gave it to Chester on an evening in October, sitting on the porch where they had sat on so many evenings, in the cool of the autumn with the children asleep inside, and the prairie making its quiet, enormous presence felt. She held out the small, wrapped package without preamble, because she was who she was. He unwrapped it and looked at it for a long time. He looked at the engraving and he looked at the watch, now on its new chain, and something moved across his face that was too complex and too deep to name simply. That was the full accounting of everything that had brought him here. The trail and the dying man and the watch and the year of doubt, and the dry goods store and the bunkhouse and the fence line and the porch evenings and the arguments and the hay and the kiss and the vows and the children and all of it, every mile of it. "Your father said to find someone worth giving it to," Chester said very quietly. "He was not wrong," Winifred said, "and neither was I when I decided to keep you." He looked up at her. His eyes were doing all their things at once, the depth and the brightness and the warmth and the certainty. "Winifred," he said. "Chester," she said. "I love you," he said, "with the entirety of what I am." "I know," she said. "I have been watching you prove it for 4 years. I find the evidence compelling." He laughed, and she felt the sound of it the same way she always did, in the deepest and most reliable part of her, and she leaned into him on the bench, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together on the porch of the Fletcher ranch. The Shepard ranch now, theirs entirely, and the stars were coming out over Kansas in the particular extravagant way they had, as though the sky were trying to show off for someone. In later years, when Alina was old enough to ask about the watch and the fob, which she did at the age of 7 with the demanding thoroughness she brought to all inquiries, Winifred sat her down at the kitchen table and told her the whole story from the beginning. Elias, who was 8 and had heard the story in fragments, sat very still and listened with the complete attention he had inherited from his father. "Grandfather, Elias gave the watch to Papa," Alina asked. "He gave it to a man he trusted," Winifred said, "and he asked that man to find someone worthy of receiving it. The watch was a kind of test, of character, of intention. Did Papa pass the test?" Winifred looked across the kitchen to where Chester was coming through the door, just back from the south pasture, bringing the particular smell of horses and open air and autumn grass. "Completely," she said. Chester looked at the 2 children at the table and then at his wife, and he read something in the room and raised an eyebrow. "What are we discussing?" he said. "The watch," Elias said seriously, "and how grandfather trusted you with it." Chester came to the table and sat down, and he looked at his son and daughter with the uncomplicated love that had never in 4 years shown any sign of running out. "Your grandfather," he said, "was a man who believed that trust was the most important thing you could offer another person, more valuable than money or land or any other material thing. He trusted me when I had not yet earned it, because he believed I was capable of earning it. That faith changed my life. And you brought the watch back to Mama," Eleanor said. "And I brought the watch back to your mother," Chester confirmed. "And then you stayed," Elia said. "And then I stayed," Chester said. Eleanor considered this with the judicial seriousness she applied to important conclusions. "That was a good idea," she announced. "The best idea I ever had," Chester said, looking at Winifred over the children's heads. She met his eyes and held them, and the kitchen was warm and the lamp was lit, and the prairie evening was settling in around the ranch house like something familiar and beloved. And Winifred Fletcher, who was Winifred Shepard now, who had watched a stranger become a husband, and a ranch become a home, and a watch become a story that her children would tell their children someday, thought about all the things that had had to go wrong and right in a specific sequence to bring her to this exact kitchen on this exact evening, with these exact people. She thought about her father's faith, which had been tested and which had held, and about Chester's honesty, which he had given her when honesty was the harder choice, and about the particular nature of second chances, which are given to those who have not yet finished becoming who they are meant to be. She looked at the watch on its chain, which she still wore, and the fob beside it with its 4 words, and she thought, yes, exactly this, all of it. "Come on then," she said, standing from the table with the efficient warmth that was entirely her own. "Who is hungry?" Both children said that they were, loudly and simultaneously, which was the most reliable fact in the world, and Chester laughed. And she went to start supper in the warm kitchen of their warm house on their shared land under the enormous, indifferent, beautiful Kansas sky. And everything was exactly what it was supposed to be, and everything was enough, and everything was good.